Today, I'm talking to Paul Davies, Senior Clinical Audit Facilitator, about an audit that we're doing about the collection and labeling of blood samples for transfusion. So, Paul, tell me, why was an audit of that topic necessary?
Well, John, this is a repeat of the National Comparative Audit we previously did back in 2012, where we found about 3% of blood samples for transfusion were rejected as a result of labelling errors. And we also identified that about 99 wrong blood in tube or WIBIT samples were received over that time period as well. Rejected samples in particular risk harm due to a patient having to be rebled or potentially suffering a delay to transfusion or procedure. So it's important that we avoid them where we can. Uh, since the audit as well, there have been a number of safety recommendations and initiatives about sample labelling, particularly a drive to increase the uptake of electronic bedside identification systems, where a sample label would be printed automatically at the bedside following a scan of the patient's wristband. These are nationally recommended things that are part of the national guidelines. However, they're quite costly and logistically challenging to implement. So we wanted to see whether or not they were actually having an impact. Over the same time period as well, obviously, we've also featured mounting workloads and pressures for staff, which has a potential to lead to increased errors. And of course, as we all know, COVID has been a big thing over the last few years, and there have been a number of changes in working practices following this, and particularly impacts on staff training may have happened. So overall, this seemed like an appropriate juncture for us to repeat the audit and reassess the impact, the extent of sample mislabeling, and also, as I say, to evaluate whether or not the electronic systems are actually associated with a reduction in sample rejection.
So, Paul, that sounds like an extremely good reason for doing that. And so many of those things, I suppose, will impact on other audit topics as well. Okay,
Hmm.
so you've got a great subject for an audit. So, but what was the aim of doing that audit?
Well, blood samples and requests for transfusion have to be labelled with the patient's first name, last name, date of birth, etc., and the identity of the member taking the blood sample. Those are national guidelines. So the primary aim of the audit was to collect information about the quality of practice with regards to that labelling process. We were also, though, looking at, as I said previously, whether or not bedside electronic identification systems had an impact on that, to assess the incidence of WIBITs during the time period, potentially to explore the reasons for sample rejection. So, as a team, to say, well, why do we feel these samples are being rejected? And to provide information through a future project for ourselves as in the NCA, looking at a targeted review and improvement process on selected sites.
It seems to me, Paul, that that's a huge amount of information to collect and very important to get that right. It needs some organization. So, what was the method you used to be able to capture all of that?
But as always with a national comparative audit, we invited all trusts and independent hospitals in the United Kingdom to provide data to the audit. So the opportunity was there for everybody to provide their data. Once we'd got that list of sites together, each site was sent an organisational questionnaire so we could gather some basic details about what the site's processes were in terms of sample rejection, and also to get an idea of what electronic systems they had on site. We also asked for a few other figures, so the overall number of requests during the time period and the number of WIBIT incidents, so we could calculate the rate of sample mislabeling and the WIBIT rate for the time period. Sites individually then were provided with paper-based data collection forms and also given the opportunity to enter data electronically into our audit website. For this audit as well, we also tried a system where we allowed sites to submit their own data. Obviously, sample mislabeling and rejection is quite a common thing for sites maybe to want to monitor themselves. So a lot of sites had automatic systems where they were collecting and reporting on this data. So we gave them the opportunity to submit this rather than conducting a separate audit and effectively repeating work that they've already done. Once we'd got all that data in, we then calculated percentages, fairly straightforward, using it in Microsoft Excel, and then compared those figures where we could to the 2012 audit data.
But I mean, that sounds very, very organized and very skillful. But in your introduction, you talked about how important it is to get that right because of the cost for one thing, and the need to maybe re-bleed a patient or not make a transfusion decision as quickly as we can. So, what everybody will want to know now is, what did the audit find? What were the results?
Well, for the audit, we got about 23,500 rejected samples audited across 179 sites for 1 month period. So that's a really large data set for us to be working with. The rejection rate we found was actually about 4.4% this year, which actually represents 50% increase compared to what we were seeing in 2012, but it was only about 3%. But we also saw quite a large potential increase in WIBITs. This time round, we looked at a single month and we identified 92 WIBITs over the course of the month, whereas with the previous cycle of the audit 10 years ago, there were 99 WIBITs reported over a 3-month period. So potentially there's quite a high increase in the number of WIBITs as well. In terms of electronic systems in place, we found 23% of sites actually had the capacity to print a label at the patient bedside, which is a good figure because that's a threefold increase compared to what we saw in 2012. Particularly, we were able to identify 4 sites who only used electronic systems for both labeling and sample request forms, so they've gone wholly electronic, and compare them with 21 sites where primarily they only used handwritten methods. And there we can actually see the sites with electronic systems fully in place only had about a 2.3% rejection rate compared to 5.9% of those sites which were completely handwritten. Again, this is as part of their standard process. However, for those sites with electronic systems, they still continue to report WIBITs. So we were still seeing WIBITs at those sites, even though they were completely electronic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge amount of data, and there must be a lot to talk about. But people watching this are going to be interested in what the key messages are. What's really important for people to take away from that audit, Paul?
Well, of course, as we've already mentioned, the sample rejection rate has seen an increase from 2012. So despite the fact it was a known problem, it's still getting worse. Is something to people to take away, which may just be a reflection of increased workload. We've also got the fact the number of WIBITs being reported has increased, which potentially we're seeing that being underreported as well, because those figures don't seem to match up with what we're aware of nationally. But that may just be an artifact of the data that we've seen this time round. The increase in sample rejection is quite possibly due to the generalized pressures, increased pressures facing clinical staff. So that's probably where that's come from. We are seeing sites with electronic labeling systems having fewer mislabeled samples. So there is a good reason for having electronic systems in place, despite the cost and the time involvement in getting those put in place. But of course, we still need to be careful because they're not actually seeing fewer WIBIT incidents. So there's still things we need to watch out for. Those electronic systems do reduce labeling errors, but they can't be seen as a substitute for positive patient identification. Staff still need training on appropriate hand labeling for areas where those systems aren't available or for when they've got downtime. So it's still important that sites have that training in place. Even in those sites where we were seeing electronic systems were in place, we were still getting reports back that samples were missing information, which should be impossible to not put on there. So there are obviously handwritten samples still being returned even at those sites, but because electronic systems are the primary thing, they're perhaps not focusing on the training quite so much, or people are forgetting that training through lack of use. One of the things we found with the data we got reported back as well was that it was often very difficult to identify the individual who was actually taking the rejected
Mm.
sample. So it was hard to give feedback to that person on the fact that they weren't completing the sample taking process properly. Um, Sites were often as well collecting reasons for mislabeling, but not necessarily in a format that was appropriate for them or useful for them to be able to analyze. So a lot of the information we were getting back from sites who were collecting their own data either didn't match up with what we were trying to collect, or it was difficult for people to actually get hold of that information, which is quite an important thing. If you're collecting data, then it should be quite easy for you to get the information you need back as and when you need it.
Yeah, it seems to me, Paul, listening to you talk, that this really important audit has shown some interesting developments or lack of development, but also some great opportunities. Now, plainly, there's an issue. Plainly, the issue can be resolved. Things can be improved. So, what's really important for people to know now is what can they do? What can sites do if their findings are not what they would expect?
Well, Obviously, the first place to start is to make sure that everybody knows the things that they should be doing. So a good way to start on that would be for all transfusion teams to make sure that their induction and refresher training on sample labeling is made available and is appropriate to their guidelines and policies. So this training, maybe even more so, you may be able to target this to areas where the rejection rates are highest. If you have your own systems for monitoring in place, that will be easy. If not, of course, the information from this audit may also be able to help you identify where that training should be targeted. If you're able to do that as well, you'll be able to assess any environmental or human factors in those areas with high mislabeling rates that might help you identify what factors are contributing to that poor practice, or what workarounds people may have put in place to make the process easier for them, which are actually leading to problems. Positive patient identification also is one of those things, again, which remains fundamental throughout the entire transfusion process, and something that should be emphasized with that training, with those refreshers, particularly with electronic bedside systems,
Mhm.
where you may be tempted to just say, well, the computer says this, and just skip those steps in there. Maybe encourage patients to check their sample labels where that's appropriate for them to do so. Um, Something else as well that is quite dear to my heart is that sites which are collecting that data automatically aren't always collecting data in a manner which enables them to have meaningful reports easily generated. I do feel that if you're collecting that data, you should be able to do something with it. Otherwise, what's the point in you collecting it? Um, where you do have it, it would be fantastic if you could use that to regularly measure or your mislabeling or WIBIT rates. That allows you to measure your improvements and to benchmark your progress. So you can see those improvements and they're demonstrable to the staff that you're actually asking to make those improvements. While the electronic systems we've suggested can't eliminate all problems, the improvement's clear. So if you can work towards a electronic system, this is the recommended gold standard and what really you should be aiming for. However, those systems aren't necessarily a universal panacea. You still need to review how they're being used. You still need to make sure staff aren't corner cutting because they've got these electronic systems in place and therefore just have to click a button effectively. Um, Particularly if you've gone completely electronic, you're going to have times where staff are going to have to fill those paper forms in still. So you should make sure that training is still embedded and is still part of the process for what you need to do. Um, Finally and lastly, we're looking at taking the information from this audit and using it to facilitate a more targeted improvement process. So hopefully over the coming months, we'll be able to identify some sites where we may be able to use this information to get in touch and hopefully have a one-to-one with those sites and go through the different ways they might improve and use the audit information to actually do something about the problems they're seeing. And hopefully we'll be able to feed this back to everyone and demonstrate some further ways that you might be able to make improvements and things you might be able to do to stop having these problems.
But Paul, it's been fascinating talking to you about this and listening to what you've done. It's a really important topic. You've obviously got
Mm,
some very, very useful data there, and you've just given some very, very useful pointers to how to carry on. But for me, the really exciting thing to hear you talk about is this further work. This working with sites now to try to see if we can help them in the program, if we can help them understand what's going on, overcoming these barriers. Because anybody that's been involved with local clinical audit or national clinical audits for a while will realize, as we do, that you could just produce the information and leave it at that. But then they become what I call a so what audits. And the last thing that we want to do in the NCA is to become a tick box exercise. So being able to go out there and going back to our previous roles as clinical audit facilitators is going to mean that we can really help to do something, which is one of our key things in the NCA, Paul. We're very, very good at collecting data. We're good at turning that data into information. And what we're now going to get really, really good at is just turning that information into change. So, Paul Davis, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about that audit.
wonderful. Thank you, John.